Lachowski i Piątkowski o prawie międzynarodowym. Podcast Wydziału Prawa i Administracji Uniwersytetu Łódzkiego oraz portalu Obserwator Międzynarodowy.
Szanowni Państwo, drodzy słuchacze, zapraszamy dziś na rozmowę z węgierskim prawnikiem doktorem Tamaszem Hoffmanem, a rozmowa została zarejestrowana w języku angielskim. Dear listeners, it is our great pleasure to invite you to another episode of our podcast on international law, featuring a special guest, a Hungarian lawyer, Dr. Tamás Hoffman, associate professor at the Department of International Relations at Corvinus University of Budapest. Dr. Hoffman is the author of numerous scholarly works on international law, focusing on some of the greatest contemporary challenges, such as Russia's aggression against Ukraine and the position of international law within the Central and Eastern European region, with the particular attention to his home country, Hungary. And actually this will allow us today to define the parameters of Hungary's approach to international law. Dear Tamás, once again, a very warm welcome to our podcast.
The pleasure is mine. Thank you for the invitation.
Yes, thank you very much for accepting our humble invitation to our podcast about international law. As Tomasz stated, we are trying to promote the voices of the Central Eastern European scholars of international law. But I need to ask you about the, let's say, very timely situation. Right now, maybe it is not as urgent as it seems a few days ago, namely the question of possible peace summit between the President Putin and President Trump in Budapest. And of course, this is an intriguing question because on one hand, we know that Hungary announced its willingness to withdraw from International Criminal Court, but still under the provision of the statute, it is obliged to at least for 1 year after the notification to basically follow the Rome Statute. So how this summit could be somehow justified in the light of the Hungary obligation under the Rome Statute and also other international commitments stemming from European Union and what would be, in my opinion, quite interesting for our listeners, also the question of the Hungarian domestic law.
So thank you very much. This is a somewhat complicated topic. So first of all, yes, I would like to reiterate the fact that Hungary is still a member state of the International Criminal Court, even though some international and Hungarian media outlets have mistakenly said that, yes, Hungary had already withdrawn. This is not the case. As you have said, Hungary will remain a state party to the ICC until the 2nd of June next year. So there is still quite a few months left from Hungary's membership, and maybe if there's a change of government, maybe Hungary can still remain in the ICC. So until Hungary is an ICC member state, under international law, it is clearly obliged to comply with the regulations of the court, and it has to implement the international arrest warrant as well that was issued by the International Criminal Court against the Russian President Vladimir Putin. Now, Hungary is in a somewhat strange position because even though it had already ratified the Rome Statute more than 20 years ago, it has never completely implemented the regulations of the ICC statutes into Hungarian domestic law. So we do have a criminal court which reflects all the international crimes that are enshrined in the Rome Statute. So we do have war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, but we did not implement some provisions that would be necessary. For example, we still have head of state immunity in Hungarian law, both criminal and civil law. And we also are missing some procedural regulations to facilitate cooperation between Hungary and The Hague, basically. So we do have some domestic legal problems with actually implementing an arrest warrant like this, but I don't think this is an insurmountable problem because, well, first of all, the Hungarian constitution actually stipulates that Hungary recognizes the generally accepted rules of international law, which includes obviously rules on international crimes. And also the Hungarian constitution very clearly stipulates that Hungary has to make sure that it implements its international obligations. So in a situation like this, well, first of all, Hungary should never allow President Putin to enter Hungary. But if President Putin somehow still arrived in Hungary, it would have to rest, in my opinion, President Putin, if not necessarily under the ICC arrest warrant, then it still should arrest Putin for the alleged international crimes it has committed in Ukraine and against Ukrainians, because this could still be done under Hungarian domestic law as well. Now, of course, this story didn't start in the past few weeks when it was first mentioned that President Putin might come to Budapest. It actually started back a few months ago when Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu visited Budapest. And of course, Benjamin Netanyahu also faces an ICC arrest warrant, just like the Russian president. And regardless, Hungary has invited him, did not arrest him. And even more, during the press conference, announcing basically the arrival of Benjamin Netanyahu, the Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban also announced that Hungary would withdraw from the ICC. And already back then, I kind of assumed that this would be a preparation for a potential visit by Vladimir Putin. And it seems that I was right, because probably the whole process of initiating a withdrawal from the ICC was justified not really by the necessity of the visitation of Benjamin Netanyahu, but rather by the plans of the Hungarian government to be able to host a potential peace summit in Budapest. And of course, as you have mentioned at the moment, we are not sure whether Putin will actually come to Budapest, but I still find it quite possible that a visit like this might take place in the coming months. Now, I also think that the withdrawal of Hungary from the ICC is not simply a voluntary act, which could be justified by a sovereign will of Hungary, but it's also a violation, potential violation of EU. So all EU countries are member states to the ICC, and the EU actually repeatedly expressed the obligation of all EU member states to cooperate with the International Criminal Court. So I think, and this is actually something that I'm still working on, is that withdrawing from the ICC is actually a violation of EU law as well, EU acquis. So I wouldn't be surprised if that could result in some more infringement procedures initiated against Hungary. Unfortunately, there are already quite a few with regards to violations of the rule of law.
Thank you very much for these comments. We would like to continue the discussion on Russia's war against Ukraine. particularly through the lens of Hungary's approach to the idea of a just peace. Because the idea of just peace, by its very nature, should include a significant international law component. For instance, and first and foremost, such issues like responsibility for the aggressor state, for the armed attack, and other legal consequences. And just to better understand the dynamics of these events, I would like to recall the voting at the UN General Assembly in 2022 when Hungary twice voted in favor, first of all, of defining Russia's actions against Ukraine as an act of aggression. It was this very historical voting on the 2nd of March 2022, and later Hungary also supported the idea of holding the aggressor accountable, including through the establishment of reparation mechanism. And here I recall the voting of 14th November 2022. However, in this year's voting condemning Russian aggression and supporting the concept of a just peace, Hungary voted against the resolution alongside, among others, Russia and also the United States, led by Trump administration. And therefore, the question arises how we should understand this Budapest position on peace after the Russian-Ukrainian war, because as our listeners know, such institutions like the Special Tribunal for the crime of aggression against Ukraine is being completed. The process of establishing this tribunal, also the reparation mechanism within the system of Council of Europe is being completed. So the question arises about the Budapest position on the issue of a just peace ending the Russian-Ukrainian war.
Well, Hungary has always had a very ambivalent position on the Russian aggression against Ukraine. On the one hand, as you have mentioned, Hungary has officially emphasized that it indeed is an act of aggression against Ukraine. So even in the past few months, leading Hungarian government politicians said that, yes, indeed, it's an act of aggression. But at the same time, if it comes to the conclusion of a peace treaty, then Ukraine should basically accept losing parts of its territory, because that would result in a lasting peace, according to Hungarian politicians. Now, it's a very strange position to take, I would say, because at the same time, in Hungary, there has been this national trauma going back to the First World War, which resulted in Hungary losing huge parts of its territory and its own ethnic Hungarian population. But at the same time, the Hungarian government still supports giving up Ukrainian territory in return for peace. Now, the official Hungarian position, at least in domestic politics, is that this war is potentially destructive not only for Ukraine and Russia, but also for entire Europe in terms of economical consequences. But also there is a danger of escalation. So the Hungarian government repeatedly mentions the possibility of a European-wide war breaking out because of Ukraine, how Hungarian citizens might end up fighting in the Ukrainian war. So just yesterday, at the time of the recording, yesterday was the 23rd of October, which is a national holiday in Hungary. Now, it's quite strange that in Hungary we celebrate, of course, the 1956 Hungarian Revolution on this day, which was quashed by the Soviets. And now on this very day, the government party, Fidesz, organized a huge protest, basically, against the EU called the Peace March, which was led by signs stating, for example, that we don't want to fight and die for Ukraine. So there is this very strange domestic political agenda which emphasizes that unless Ukraine gives up parts of its territory, then surely maybe even World War III will start. So this is something that I would say animates the Hungarian position. And this is something that leads to this ambivalent position in external politics. So Hungary does vote sometimes for measures that condemn Ukraine. It has voted for all the EU sanctions packages, for example, but at the same time, it tries to achieve some kind of peace agreement, which would be highly detrimental to Ukraine. And because of this reason, the Hungarian government does not officially participate in the creation of the special tribunal for the crime of aggression against Ukraine, and it doesn't support any kind of reparation mechanisms for Ukraine. It doesn't support officially using the frozen Russian assets to compensate Ukraine, or if not compensate, then to be used, for example, for buying weapons. So this is in a nutshell the very peculiar Hungarian position.
Now, I would like to turn my question into, let's say, a little bit more of the issue of the foreign policy. We are observing that some experts are calling Hungarian foreign policy as an example of multi-dimension or multi-vector policy. And I believe Hungarian Prime Minister, he spoke himself that we have good relationship with Tehran, we get good contacts with Beijing, we got working relationship with Russia, good relationship with Washington, but we don't have particularly good connection with Brussels. So my question is, what is the current, let's say, paradigm of Hungarian foreign policy? Because on one hand, we could kind of understand that Hungary is following, for instance, the European Union sanction, another package of sanction, which is requiring, basically approval of all the member states of the European Union. And Hungary still supports those sanctions, as you mentioned before, kind of joined the hip in naming what happened to Ukraine as an aggression, but on the other hand, try to, let's say, abstain from certain activities and try to portray Hungary as a neutral state. There is this impression that Hungary kind of represents the history of a Cold War, that between East and West there was a group of states called non-aligned movement. And we understand that Hungary is now withdrawing, intends to withdraw from the ICC. Whether it's crystallized is, of course, another questions. But do you expect that in the future, Hungary is going to, let's say, announce more intention to withdraw from certain institutions or international treaties? And basically, my question here kind of refers to this, let's say, unique position, unique foreign policy model of Hungary, that neither the West nor the East, but something very, very, I would say, genuine in terms of this special approach to foreign policy. What do you think about this this paradigm?
So the official name of this paradigm, this Hungarian foreign policy paradigm, is connectivity. The idea behind it is that Hungary could basically reap the benefits of being a kind of interlocutor between different regions, between different civilizations, maybe, that even though it's part of the European Union, it doesn't have to completely align with the EU foreign policy agenda. In the first part, basically, of the Fidesz's term, this was called opening to the East, but now, as I said, it's called connectivity because now it's broader than just having good relationships with China and Central Asian countries. Now the idea is that Hungary becomes basically a completely neutral country, and it doesn't necessarily want to emphasize Western values when it interacts with other countries. Instead, it tries to create good economic relationships, and also it tries to use its somewhat neutral position to sometimes act as a mediator as well. Now the problem is, of course, is that you can't be completely neutral. That's impossible. Because if you support basically all countries, then first of all, you don't support anybody. And in case of a serious problem, you might end up being completely alone. There is a reason why states do have alliances with each other. Now, Hungary, as far as I understand, wants to enjoy being in one of the strongest alliances in the world, in the EU, and also within the NATO alliance. But at the same time, when it's more favorable, presumably for Hungary, it wants to forget some of its obligations stemming from its membership in this alliance. So it's very difficult to tell whether Hungary is truly moving away from Western institutions or not, because, as I said, a lot of verbal actions, I would say, so a lot of communiques, a lot of declarations, and so on, are just symbolic. They are not really aimed at the international audience. They are rather aimed at the Hungarian domestic audience. So right after the Fidesz government took helm in 2010, they have already started this so-called war of independence against Brussels. So the European Union has always been used as this oppressive force that tries to restrain Hungarian sovereignty. There have been other peace marches in the past, not just this year, which were led by banners stating that we will not be colony of Brussels and things like that. But at the same time, Hungary has always cooperated with the EU in the really important issues. So there have been a lot of symbolic conflicts between Hungary and Brussels, but most of these conflicts were more noise than reality, I would say. Now, there is one aspect of the EU-Hungarian relationship which is truly problematic, and that's the field of rule of law. Especially in the past few years, the EU has become progressively more concerned about the rule of law processes in Hungary, how the Hungarian government's decisions adversely affect media, how they adversely impact human rights, especially LGBT rights. And we could go on. And because of this, a lot of Hungarian EU funds have been suspended for a significant time now, which causes, of course, significant economic problems in Hungary. Nevertheless, the predominant, overwhelming majority of the Hungarian population is pro-EU. So every single survey that have been taken in Hungary for the past 30 years have repeatedly said that I would say more than 70% of the Hungarian population supports Hungarian EU membership, and this hasn't changed at all. So Fidesz, which is a populist party, has to take into account these facts. It cannot just break up with the EU. It cannot just start a withdrawal from the EU, for example, because that could lead to potential disastrous backlash against. And then they will, in my opinion, they would not take this chance, this potential chance that their realm could collapse in a situation like that. So I do think that this relationship, until Fidesz is in power, will remain the same. We will have a vocal, hostile relationship with the EU, but that's just a surface, because when it comes to really important issues, Hungary will become a cooperating member of the European Union. But at the same time, of course, if there are more infringement procedures against Hungary, if there are more problems about the rule of law questions, for example, it's absolutely possible that there might be more tensions and more potential problems between Hungary and the EU.
Thank you very much. And we'd love to continue this issue on the question of rule of law and international law in Hungary in a more domestic manner, because as we speak, as you mentioned, Hungary is commemorating the 69th anniversary of the 1956 Hungarian Revolution, which was, as you noticed, crushed by Soviet tanks. And I even remember when I was a PhD candidate and was working on my PhD thesis connected to the issue of transitional justice, I read your article about Hungarian, let's say, transition to democracy through the lens of international law. And I was really impressed that the Constitutional Court of Hungary stood in a way of, let's say, trying to limit the very political, maybe social pressure to hold those people responsible for the crimes of 1956 without any reference to international legal parameters. And it was very impressive that Constitutional Court actually reshaped or shaped this the rule of law paradigm in Hungary after the transition to democracy. And so the question is, what has happened over the 3 decades of Hungarian democracy that the highest national courts are no longer appear to safeguard the values derived from international law. Of course, this populist approach is very visible in many other European states, like also in Poland. Let's take an example of very populist law against mass migration. It is very, very visible also in our country. Nevertheless, the question is about the position of Hungarian highest national courts, like the Constitutional Court, that at least it is this kind of an image that the Constitutional Court did or does not want to follow the path which was crafted by this court after 1989.
So, in terms of the relationship between international law and domestic law, Hungary could be termed a moderate dualist state. So it means that we, as I said earlier, Hungary does accept the internationally recognized rules of international law, which means that actually customary international law, jus cogens rules, and general principles of law are automatically part of the Hungarian legal system, domestic law, even without any implementation. But international treaties have to be implemented into Hungarian domestic law in order to have an effect. So this creates a very interesting situation. And as I said, this hasn't changed in the past 30 years, even though we have a new constitution for more than 10 years now. This rule hasn't changed. So international law is automatically part of Hungarian law when it comes to customary international law. And every rule of international law has a very high place in the hierarchy of norms in Hungarian law. So it's international norms actually have a higher standing than normal domestic laws, but they have a lower standing than constitutional norms. So in case of a potential clash between international norms and Hungarian domestic law, international law prevails unless the clash is between constitutional law norms and international law norms. So this is very important, and this hasn't changed. Now, of course, quite a few things have changed. However, one of the important things is that, of course, right now, the Hungarian Constitutional Court is composed of judges who were appointed by the governing party. And most of these people have a very strong attachment, or even on a personal level, to the ruling party. So, for example, just quite recently, a few months ago, one of the newly appointed Constitutional Court judges was actually a former Fidesz Minister of Justice. So I think that tells quite a lot about the Hungarian Constitutional Court now. So the Hungarian Constitutional Court now is steeped in a very sovereignty-centered approach. So whenever there is a potential clash between EU law or international law and Hungarian law, they always try to first ascertain what the potential will of the legislator was. And if it's already part of the constitution, then they will say that, yeah, the constitution has to prevail. I have to say, though, that if there is a clear clash between international law rules and Hungarian domestic law rules, the Hungarian Constitutional Court still recognizes the superiority of international law. So just to give you one interesting example, a few months ago, the Hungarian Constitutional Court actually held that Hungary violates its international obligations by not addressing climate change effectively. Why? Because again, Hungary has international obligations stemming from different international agreements. So I wouldn't say that this Hungarian tradition of defending international law at a court level has completely disappeared, but it has indeed very, very significantly diminished compared to 30 years ago. Because as you mentioned, in the beginning of the 1990s, the Hungarian Constitutional Court indeed used international law in a way to try to mediate basically between different political agendas and to reach a compromise position between one party which said that all crimes committed during communism should be prosecuted even though if they have lapsed because of statutes of limitations, and the other position which said that no such crimes could be prosecuted. Now, national courts, to some degree, I think, still remain guardians of international values in Hungary. In Hungary, international courts are actually increasingly invoke international norms, which is quite interesting because originally this was not the case. I mean, we can kind of understand why this is the case. Domestic judges are usually not international lawyers. They might have studied some international law at law school. Indeed, in Hungary, it's actually obligatory in every law school to study international law, but they are not experts. And if a judge meets a new legal problem, then they will probably approach it from their domestic legal socialization and not necessarily from international law. However, I have seen quite a few Hungarian court judgments which still refer to international law, international treaties as well, and exceptionally sometimes even customary international law. But that's more of an outlier than the rule in Hungary, fortunately.
Now, my next question, let's say switching the perspective for less national to more global. And I think we all could agree that 2025 is a special year for international relationship. We are observing the rise of the multipolar world, and we need to embrace the challenges that the race of different stakeholders, different sources of powers is providing to the international community, etc. Here, there is also a question of what is going to be, what's the road, what's the forecast for the international law? Because on one hand, just recently, I believe at the beginning of this week, German Chancellor Friedrich Merz stated that, okay, we have to embrace the end of international law, maybe the end of the international law as a guiding principle of the politics of countries, of states, or the departure of the so-called rules-based international order, a term which I particularly don't like too much, because in my opinion, while we could discuss what international law is, we could talk about the structure of international law, we could provide the sources of international law. For me, the rule-based international order is a phrase without the content, and it's being widely circulating around the press, around the commentators, and most notably among the politicians of the Western world. But actually, I believe if you ask them what's actually the definition of the rules-based international order, they would have a very, I would say, ambiguous response. We could kind of guess what does it mean, that maybe this is something closer to the liberal approach to international relationship, to the liberal school of international relationship. But on the other hand, we are seeing messages from, let's say, other corner of the world, notably from China, like Chinese Foreign Ministry Wang Yi during the Munich Security Summit in February 2025, or Xi Jinping comments on the SCO meeting this summer in China, which you mentioned Hungary was a part of this summit, and they spoken at great lengths about the importance of international law, but in a way that our approach, I mean Chinese approach, is now going to be devoid of this hypocrisy, Western hypocrisy here, so-called Western hypocrisy. So my question is, because we kind of have to also accept that Poland and Hungary greatly contributed of this, let's say, liberal approach to international relationship, and of course this liberal approach kind of centralized, put significant attention to the role of international law. But what now will happen for those, let's say, small or medium states, especially here in this our region, which has history of being, unfortunately, an area of friction, constant friction between great powers. And is Hungary prepared to embrace a world without international law? Or my question here is also kind of sub-question: is this discussion somehow circulating among Hungarian international lawyers? What is their approach to those changes that we are observing right now?
Oh, this is a huge topic. So first of all, I would like to share my feelings about this concept of rule-based international order, which has been circulating in Western Europe for a while now. It's a term that has been used by the EU quite often, and I think it's a horrible term which has greatly potentially contributed to the current perceived decline of international law. Because as you have mentioned, we do know what international law is. Of course, we do have a lot of debates about its content and its application, but more or less 99% of international lawyers could agree about specific norms of international law. While the concept of rule-based international order is something that are international law rules that are cherry-picked by one particular country or region or alliance for their purposes. And it also at least for me, kind of expresses the idea that we don't have to accept all rules of international law. There are specific rules that we think are more important, and we will only enforce those ones. And we won't really particularly care about the rest of them. So I think that the very term rules-based international order already expresses a deep crisis in international law, and these deep crisis goes to the very problem that international law faces, and that is that countries, especially powerful countries, don't necessarily want to accept all its rules, and they would really like to cherry pick among them. Now, of course, with the rise of Trump and other authoritarian rulers and leaders, we have an even more serious situation now, because President Trump has repeatedly basically expressed its willingness to completely abandon any international regulations. I mean, at least for me, the most shocking thing was to hear President Trump so openly talking about potentially annexing Greenland, which would be completely unprecedented in the past 80 years, of course. And it basically expressed its willingness to give up Ukrainian territories to an aggressor country, which again would be a complete disastrous break from the post-Second World War legal order. And if we truly arrive at the point international legal rules could be completely abandoned, then I think it could be disastrous for smaller and even medium-sized countries. And Hungary is a smaller country. So I think Carl Schmitt once said, somewhat derisive, that international law is the law of the deep. And to some extent, this is true, because legal obligations, legal bounds do restrict powerful countries more than smaller ones, and smaller countries enjoy more benefit from an international legal universe where, for example, you cannot annex the territory of other countries. So if we truly arrived at a point where international law would be abandoned, I think that would be disastrous for a lot of countries. Now, I think in Hungary, this is not conceptualized that. I think that the Hungarian leadership actually thinks that the fact that we are within the EU and within the NATO could provide us enough protection to enjoy some potential benefit from abandoning international legal commitments. So we kind of see Hungary now completely abandon its international legal obligations concerning the International Criminal Court, which again is a shocking thing, but now in Hungary it has been normalized. We also see that Hungary does not comply with its obligations under the Refugee Convention or its obligations stemming from EU norms concerning the treatment of asylum seekers. Again, now this is just thrown out of the window, and it's treated as if these kinds of legal obligations didn't exist. So I think the Hungarian leadership thinks that we can benefit from EU and NATO membership in terms of protection and in terms of being a part of a very powerful economic bloc. And at the same time, we can still reap the benefits from abandoning international law rules in other areas. So yes, in some ways, I think the Hungarian leadership would like to see a return to geopolitics, because it feels that we are part of a bloc which which belongs to great powers. So as parts of the EU, we can afford not to be part of the international legal order. And who cares if the abandonment of the international legal order could be disastrous for other countries outside this bloc. Now, Hungarian scholars, at least international law scholars, almost unanimously reject and condemn this approach. I would like to mention that this spring, the community of Hungarian international lawyers has issued a declaration which condemned the Hungarian government's recent actions, which clearly violate international law, so including the non-implementation of the ICC arrest warrant, or, for example, this is something I haven't mentioned yet, the Hungarian government has recently introduced a new rule which would allow for the so-called suspension of Hungarian citizenship in case there is a dual citizenship and this Hungarian citizen had done something that's against or contrary to the interests of Hungary. So right now in Hungary, if you have a dual nationality and this dual citizenship is not a citizenship from the EU, then your Hungarian citizenship could be suspended. And if your Hungarian citizenship is suspended, then you will be deported from Hungary immediately. So we have passed the resolution, and I have to say that this declaration has been signed by the predominant majority of lawyers, and I'm really proud of my colleagues, I have to say.
Great. Thank you for this comment. We are slowly approaching the end of our conversation, but let's allow ourselves one more last question. At the beginning of this year, we met with Tamás in Vienna to discuss the emerging concept of second world approaches to international law, the acronym SWAIL, and here we have to recall at least, among others, two great scholars, Patryk Labuda and Marek Wasiński, who are trying to introduce this term. And the question, my question about SWAIL is touching upon the issue whether this concept may be one of the possible remedies for the observed crisis of international law that we have just discussed, because as we know, the notion of the so-called second world was crafted during the Cold War, and it referred to the communist bloc centered in Moscow. However, today this term is a bit differently defined to specify the very independent position of Central and Eastern Europe. However, we would like to ask you about your perception to this concept. Do you think that it really might be a kind of a remedy for our region to, or let's say a reopening of our region in this intellectual debates over international law and politics, or it is something that's, let's say, cannot overcome this permanent crisis of international law that we have just discussed?
Okay, so I think an acknowledgement that Central Eastern Europeans are in a liminal position, meaning that they are stuck somewhere between the East and the West, would be very important for the legitimacy of international law. Because, I mean, we have to say, unfortunately, that in most post-socialist countries, the support for international legal norms is not particularly high, I would say. And this, I think, stems at least partially from a generally shared feeling that we are somewhat abandoned, or even we feel a little bit oppressed. We are, at least most Central Eastern European countries are now EU member states, but we don't necessarily feel completely accepted as being the EU, like old EU member states. We in some ways feel as, or often feel as, secondary EU citizens, and this has a huge ramification, not just in a general sentiment, but also in international law as well. Because in international law, Central and Eastern Europe has always been an extremely important geographic space, but it has never been a significant contributor to the intellectual space of international law. So what do I mean by this? First of all, I mean, obviously Central Eastern Europe has been the place where both world wars started. This is a place where we have a lot of crises, a lot of juicy cases that international lawyers can dissect and discuss and elaborate on. But when it comes to the representation of people from the region, I mean, the significance of Central and Eastern Europe is almost zero. I'm not saying that you cannot have a career as an international lawyer if you're from Central Eastern Europe. Far from it. We have several great professors from Central and Eastern Europe. I mean, one of my main research areas is international criminal law. I mean, Lauterpacht came from Eastern Europe. Raphael Lemkin came from Eastern Europe. There are dozens of great professors who hailed from Eastern Europe and made a huge career in the West. But we hardly see anybody who could make a real career remaining in Eastern Europe. Why is that? Well, primarily because Central Eastern Europeans are not part of the same networks as Western international networks. Eastern European academic institutions are not viewed in the same light as Western academic institutions. So for Eastern European scholars, I feel that there is a glass that is extremely difficult to overcome. And this glass ceiling results in the shocking underrepresentation of Eastern European scholars in the really important international conferences, in the international journals, the board of editors, international journals, and we could go on and on and on. I mean, I think it's a common experience for most Eastern European scholars that their applications are much more readily rejected because they are from the East, and not necessarily because of the lack of ideas, but more of the lack of perceived prestige. And also, and this is something I'm working right now, I mean, this disregard for Central and Eastern Europe as an intellectual space also results in disregarding potential jurisprudence coming from this region. So right now, I'm working on a paper which tries to show how during the Second World War, international criminal proceedings, of course, the UNWC, the war crimes war crimes trials were basically collected from different regions, and this collection of cases became then a very important foundation for creating modern international criminal law as we know it in the 1990s and 2000s. However, there have been a lot of criminal trials in Eastern Europe in the aftermath of the Second World War. And many of these cases have actually been conducted with international law or relying on international criminal norms, and these cases have completely been forgotten. So forgetting about this region has a direct impact on the formation and development of international law as well. And yes, I think this has an impact on a legitimacy crisis as well, because if a huge geographical area, which has actually hundreds of millions of inhabitants, is completely excluded from the development of international law, and at the same time is officially viewed as being part of Europe, creates such a tension, I think, which again has a detrimental impact on international law. So I don't have huge hopes for a revolutionary change, but I think if we manage to introduce the idea of swale, it could at least raise attention to the existing problem. And who knows, maybe in the long term, it could have an impact that Eastern European scholars could actually become part of this international academic.
Tamas, thank you very much for taking part in our podcast. It was extremely inspiring and thought-provoking conversation. And this last point about scholars from Central and Eastern Europe and underrepresentation of the voices of our region in the global discourse on international law and politics, of course, it is a very significant remark that you have made. So thank you for this, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for the invitation. It was great having a discussion with you.
Thank you, Doctor, for being with us. I think this discussion shows us the importance of our mission of our humble small podcast to give voice to audience that may be not that very much aware about the concept of swale and the importance that Central and Eastern Europe scholars shall have a voice in this complicated word. So thank you very much once again for being with us. For our English listening speaker, where we would like to give you an information that, of course, we are entering our 4th season. We are going to have a couple of more episodes in English, so please stay in us. And now I'm switching in Polish to summarize our podcast. Szanowni Państwo, bardzo dziękujemy za obecność w dzisiejszym odcinku. Będzie jeszcze więcej odcinków w języku angielskim z ciekawymi gośćmi. Na dzień dzisiejszy to wszystko z naszej strony i serdecznie pozdrawia niezmiennie za mikrofonu
Tomasz Lachowski
i Mateusz Piątkowski. Do usłyszenia, do zobaczenia.